After my grandfather left me everything, my parents who abandoned me as a baby sued me. When I entered the courtroom, my mom rolled her eyes. Then the judge froze. The air in the Denver County courtroom was colder than the aspen winters I had grown up surviving alone. I was Randy, 30 years old, a prosecutor of financial crimes who specialized in finding the truth hidden in complex lies. Yet, nothing prepared me for becoming the defendant in a lawsuit filed by Marilyn and Dexter Graves, the two people who had abandoned me before I could form a single memory of them. Their lawsuit felt like a vicious joke. Less than 2 weeks prior, I sat in my grandfather, Alistair Rohr's lawyer's office as his will was read. I didn't ask for it, but every asset, the house in the Rockies, the land, the rare book collection, the $3.4 million he had saved across a lifetime of disciplined work, it all belonged to me. Not because I was his grandson, but, as the will stipulated, because I was the one who had stayed. Alistair, the retired judge who raised me, was gone now. His absence was a quiet, constant ache. And before I could properly grieve his loss and process the sudden weight of the inheritance, the papers arrived. Marilyn and Dexter claimed I had used my proximity to a mentally compromised elderly man to manipulate him out of his fortune. They painted me as a greedy opportunist, demanding the full estate be reverted to Marilyn, his only biological child. My footsteps echoed on the marble floor as I walked to the defense table. The large courtroom gallery was packed with reporters and curious spectators, all eager to witness this public family implosion. The whispers and the clicks of distant cameras were a physical weight pressing down on me. I felt exposed, stripped down to the primal, 30-year-old wound of rejection. Then I saw them. Marilyn sat perfectly straight beside her attorney, her posture rigid, her makeup flawless. She looked ready for a luncheon, not a courtroom battle against the son she abandoned. The instant her eyes found mine, she executed a small, dismissive eye roll. It was a gesture so fast, so sharp, it felt like a scalpel cutting open every wound she had ever left on me. It was the same cold indifference I had read about in my grandmother's journals, the chilling proof that I was nothing more than an inconvenience. My biological father, Dexter, sat next to her. Unlike Marilyn, he wouldn't meet my gaze. He simply fiddled with his cheap tie, pulling at the knot as though he wanted to disappear entirely. I hadn't seen either of them in years, not since the funeral where they stood apart, watching the crowd instead of mourning the man who had supported them financially for decades. I took my seat beside Harper Wynn, my grandfather's friend and our attorney. The old familiar emptiness settled over me, a constant reminder of not being wanted. I focused on Harper, a steady presence who treated this legal battle as personally as I did. The room didn't truly shift until Judge Rowan Hale looked up from his notes. His gaze crossed the space and snagged on mine. Mid-sentence, his voice faltered. His eyes locked onto my face, and he froze. The court reporter looked up. The lawyers exchanged confused glances. It wasn't shock at the magnitude of the case, or surprise at my identity. It was recognition. It was as if Judge Hale, a man who had practiced law under my grandfather's mentorship, saw a ghost. He saw Alistair, the esteemed judge who had shaped his entire judicial philosophy, standing right there in my posture, my face, and my steady, disciplined presence. The recognition in his eyes was instantly flooded with something like shock and profound grief. In that single, frozen instant, I understood that this trial was not only about the money. It was about something far heavier, the truth of Alistair's legacy and the battle for his soul. now fought through the person he had chosen. This was a war for who stayed and who walked away. The case had just become personal for the court itself. The judge's look of recognition, catching the ghost of Dexter in my face, pulled me out of the sterile courtroom and back into the cold reality of my childhood. To understand why my presence stopped the trial cold, I had to revisit the history my parents now tried to erase. It went back to a night in Aspen, thick with snow, when I was 4 months old. The story, told to me gently by my grandmother Odette, was that the wind screamed through the pines as Marilyn left me on the porch of the cabin. I was wrapped in a blanket too thin for the mountain cold, and I was half blue when Dexter, my grandfather, opened the door after hearing a sound between a cry and a choke. Attached to the blanket was a rushed note. "I can't do this. Please take him." Odette rushed me to the fire, warming me against her chest, a simple act of unconditional love that thawed more than just the cold. They had no son of their own, only Marilyn, the same woman now sitting in court, suing me for the privilege of being rescued. I grew up in that cabin, surrounded by the quiet, steady rhythm of their lives. I remember the smell of pinewood smoke, the low hum of Dexter's radio at 7 o'clock sharp, slept, and the sight of my grandfather, spreading case files across the kitchen table. He taught me how to think, how to read people, and how truth operates when you strip away excuses. Those were the moments that formed the disciplined prosecutor I became. My grandparents had given me a foundation of unwavering love and principle, but they couldn't erase the original, primal wound. There were days I watched other kids after school and wondered what it felt like to have a hand reach back for you, without conditions, to be chosen by the two people who were biologically meant to want you. For years, I believed Marilyn and Dexter had simply disappeared after leaving me. It was only as I grew older that Dexter admitted the simple truth: they never disappeared. They just never showed up. Not for a birthday, a holiday, or a single school event. Dexter and Odette tried countless times to reach them, but their calls and letters were never answered. The ground shifted completely a few years ago, after my grandmother passed. I was cleaning out her desk and found a second, smaller journal tucked behind a row of worn recipe books. The paper was fragile, but the ink was painfully clear. The first entry detailed a quiet, unannounced visit from Marilyn. It wasn't to see me. It was to ask for money. Odette wrote of her gentle attempts to guide the conversation toward me, asking if Marilyn wanted to meet or talk to her son. Odette's entry was crushing in its simplicity. She never asked about Randy. Not once did she write his name in the conversation. The entries continued over several years, each visit a repeat performance. Marilyn arriving, asking for money, and immediately growing cold or dismissive when Odette brought me up. I sat at that same kitchen table reading those faded pages, realizing Odette had been protecting me from a truth far colder than the aspen snow. My biological mother was not absent, she was transactional. Her return was only ever conditional, only ever when she needed something. Had Odette planned to tell me? Or was she trying to protect the last vestiges of my hope? She died before I could ask her. And now, here I was, back in a courtroom, facing the same woman who had walked away from me 3 times without even looking back. The emptiness I carried had just been replaced with a sharp, clarifying pain. Their current lawsuit was simply an escalation, a new, louder demand for money. They were demanding the life they never gave me, now that it came with $3.4 million attached. I knew then that their claim was built on a lie, and defending the will meant finally defending the truth of my chosen life. The first full day of testimony began, and with the chilling certainty gained from my grandmother's journal, I watched my parents' attorney launch into the prosecution of my life. I was no longer just the grandson, I was the villain they needed to invent. The opposing counsel, a polished man, whose voice was professionally trained to sound sincere, began constructing his false narrative. He painted Alcester not as the mountain-hiking, legal scholar he was, but as a frail, confused man, isolated from his true family. He claimed I, Randy, had systematically controlled access to the home, manipulating my grandfather emotionally and mentally in his final years. Hearing him rewrite Alcester's life felt like a slap in slow motion. This was not the man who had debated legal philosophy with me 2 nights before his passing. To solidify their claim, they introduced their core evidence. First, a letter, supposedly written by Alcester, expressing fear that I was pushing him to sign papers he did not understand. At first glance, the handwriting resembled his script. But the pressure was inconsistent. The loops were too wide. I knew that handwriting like I knew my own breath. This was a forgery. Then came the audio recording. It was close, almost uncanny, but the cadence was wrong, the natural softness on the vowels missing. They had clearly tried to mimic his voice, but, as a prosecutor who had dissected hundreds of fraudulent documents and recordings, I knew the cadence of the lie. Whoever made that recording had spent enough time near my grandfather to be convinced they could fake it. This wasn't just desperation for money. This was criminal orchestration. Harper Wynne rose, calm as a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. She systematically dismantled the physical frailty narrative. Slept. She introduced medical records showing Alcester had passed cognitive evaluations with exceptional clarity just a week before his death. She reminded the court that he had presided over cases demanding his sharp mental acuity until mere months before he passed. But the opposing counsel had an ace up his sleeve, a surprise witness. A woman they claim was our neighbor in Aspen, who insisted I had aggressively turned her away when she tried to visit Alcester. I searched my memories, the names and faces of every local who lived within miles of our remote cabin. I had never seen this woman before in my life. She took the stand, her performance rehearsed. She spoke as if she had shared decades of small-town intimacy with my grandparents. The lie felt suffocating, but I held my composure. I knew she was the weakest point in their fabricated story, and I waited for Harper to find the crack. Under cross-examination, the pressure began to tell. The witness slipped, admitting she had only ever spoken to Alcester twice. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Harper then produced security footage from the day the woman claimed she was denied entry. The footage showed Alcester and me, not isolated in the cabin, but laughing together on a ski lift in Vail, miles away. The woman stammered, her face flushing, sweating beneath the bright courtroom lights as the false narrative cracked wide open. Her entire testimony collapsed into a pile of transparent lies. The momentum of the room tilted instantly in our favor. My rage at their audacity transformed into a cold, professional determination. I had fought this light of fraud before, but this time, the crime was against the truth of the only man who had ever chosen me. We had exposed the lie, but I knew my parents would go to any length to win. And this was only the beginning. The successful dismantling of my parents' first false witness had rattled them. But it only proved they would pivot and try again. The second week of the trial opened with something I was unprepared for, an overwhelming sense of validation. People from my childhood, the quiet voices of Aspen, were walking into the courtroom as if summoned by the truth itself. Harper, called Alistair's longtime physical therapist, a steady man with silver hair. He spoke plainly, listing dates and sessions, confirming Alistair was fiercely protective of his autonomy and fully independent until the very end. He showed no signs of confusion or diminished capacity. Every calm, professional, permit chipped away at Marilyn's narrative that my grandfather was fragile. Next came the sculptor who lived across the meadow from our cabin. She spoke about the rhythm of our lives, describing Alistair bringing her stacks of books, and how his face lit up when he spoke about me. She testified, her voice steady and warm, that he described me as the only person I trust without hesitation. Her words were a shield, defending not just me, but the dignity Marilyn's accusations had tried to strip away from my grandfather. Then came the true shift, the moment that cut through the legal formality and hit the core of my abandonment. Harper called my third-grade teacher, a quiet man with kind, tired eyes. He stood at the witness stand and recounted an incident years ago, when Marilyn had come to the school. The collective gasp in the courtroom was audible when he explained why she came. It wasn't to check on my progress, not to see how I was doing, or even to look at me through the classroom window. She demanded documentation proving she was legally my mother, so she could access financial aid meant for low-income children. Slept. The teacher stated clearly that she never asked about me, never spoke my name, and left immediately upon receiving the necessary forms. I watched Marilyn's face stiffen. Her jaw was tight, as if she could hold the truth in place through sheer, unyielding force. Dexter frantically pulled at her sleeve, urging her to sit still. The flawless facade they had brought into court, the perfect composure they had maintained, began to splinter. Harper pressed the attack. She presented bank statements tracing a staggering 22 years of financial support. $845,000 sent directly from Alistair to Marilyn. This fact brutally contradicted any claim that Alistair had cut them off or left them wanting. He had been quietly funding the life they had chosen, the life they chose over me, for decades. Marilyn sat frozen, unable to spin a lie quickly enough to survive the blow of the evidence. Then Harper produced the final piece of evidence for the day, a security camera clip. The footage, played on the large screen for the entire courtroom to see, showed Marilyn standing at my grandfather's gate years earlier. She had driven all the way to Aspen. But the moment she learned Alistair was not home, she turned her expensive car around and drove away. No note, no call, no attempt to see me. She had the opportunity she had claimed she was denied. And she walked away. The weight of that realization settled over me, sharp and clarifying. A lifetime of internal suffering, of wondering, why wasn't I enough? Suddenly had an answer that cut and healed all at once. The truth wasn't that I was lacking. The truth was that she had simply never wanted me, only the financial benefit she believed I represented. As the court buzzed with murmurs, Dexter completely lost his composure. He snapped at Marilyn, grabbing her arm too tightly, hissing at her to compose herself. She jerked away, her voice rising with furious resentment. "This is your fault," she spat, loud enough that the courtroom turned entirely to watch them combust. Their partnership, their carefully crafted performance, was collapsing in front of me before the verdict had even been reached. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the tide turning decisively. The explosion of fury between Marilyn and Dexter the previous day had confirmed that their lawsuit was built on nothing but desperate, coordinated lies. The morning of the second week, the tension in the courtroom was palpable, signaling they were ready for their boldest move yet. The plaintiff's attorney, ignoring the recent humiliation, introduced a surprise witness, a man identified as Dr. Alpert. He claimed to have evaluated Alcester in his final days and testified that my grandfather showed clear signs of confusion, hesitation, and even fear about his financial affairs. Harper's head snapped up. This witness was not only new, but he had never been disclosed in any pre-trial materials. A blatant breach of procedure and a strategic ambush. Judge Hale allowed limited testimony, but the damage was intended to be immediate. The attorney paraded the doctor forward as the missing piece of their narrative. The professional validation that Alcester was compromised. As the doctor spoke, his demeanor, his overly guarded gaze, kept tugging at my memory. Where had I seen him? He was too polished, too smooth for a genuine small-town physician, and his claims contradicted every medical record we had. Then it clicked. I had seen him before, briefly, at Alcester's funeral, standing near the back, not with the mourners, but beside Dexter. That realization hit me like a cold gust of aspen wind. This wasn't coincidence, this was arrangement. This doctor was part of the orchestration, a paid professional brought in to fraudulently testify. Harper immediately challenged the doctor's credentials and relationship with my grandfather. Slept. When she requested his medical records detailing his supposed evaluation of Alcester, the doctor stuttered before claiming, weakly, that they had been misfiled or misplaced in the rush of the case. The courtroom buzzed with outrage. A doctor losing crucial records in a high-profile case looked highly suspicious, if not completely orchestrated. Without solid proof of payment or connection, however, we were forced to hold our ground. I focused my determination, pushing my anger down to a cold, sharp point. The key to ending this was finding the link. The absolute proof of this conspiracy. That night, instead of preparing for the next day's legal arguments, I returned to the cabin in Aspen, focusing on my prosecutor instincts. I went straight to the storage cabinets in Alcester's study, searching for anything I might have overlooked. Tucked behind a row of old case binders, I found a second journal belonging to Odette, smaller and more fragile than the first, which she had kept separate from her daily entries. The pages detailed a confrontation that happened a year before Alcester's death. Slept, Marilyn had demanded that the will be changed so she could receive a portion of the estate. When my grandparents refused, she had outright threatened legal action. Odette noted that Marilyn, in her fury, had talked only about what she believed she deserved. Then came the final entry, penned shortly before Odette's passing. She described a strange man who came to the door, unannounced, asking intrusive questions about Alcester's health and if the will had been revised recently. My grandmother, ever observant, had noted his build, his face, and specifically, a faint scar near his ear. I raced back to my apartment, pulling up the court files. I stared at the photograph of Dr. Alpert. The description in the journal matched him perfectly. The morning following my discovery, Harper presented the findings. She read the journal entry aloud, her voice steady and precise, describing Marilyn's demands and threats. Then she moved to the final entry. Slept, connecting the description of the strange man at the gate, the man who was clearly gathering intelligence for a lawsuit, to the surprise witness, Dr. Alpert. The courtroom exploded with whispers and disbelief. Judge Hale raised his hand for silence, his face dark with disapproval. He ordered an independent immediate inquiry into Dr. Alpert's credibility and his relationship with Marilyn and Dexter. The facade they had clung to fractured completely. Their carefully constructed narrative was unraveling, not just due to legal evidence, but because of the deep, enduring truth recorded by the woman they had tried to silence, my grandmother. I sat there, feeling every eye in the room shift from suspicion of me to outrage at them. This wasn't just about inheritance anymore. This was about protecting Alistair and Odette's integrity, their legacy, and the truth of the life they built for me. And whoever had manipulated the shadows of this case was finally being pulled into the light. Everything now hinged on the preliminary ruling. The discovery of my grandmother Odette's second journal had initiated the criminal inquiry, but the legal case itself still required a definitive conclusion. The courtroom was overflowing, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Spectators whispered, watching every twitch of Marilyn's impeccably sculpted face and every nervous shift of Dexter's pale frame. Harper rose for our closing arguments. She chose not to focus on complex legal precedents, but on the simple, overwhelming force of truth. She centered her entire presentation around Odette's ink, reading aloud the passages that described years of disappointment, of my grandparents trying to maintain a fractured connection with their daughter while desperately protecting me from the damage of her constant absence. Listening to Harper read those entries felt like reliving every unspoken hurt my grandparents had silently endured. Their pain, recorded in fading ink, filled the room in a way Marilyn's performance could not spin or disguise. Then came the moment that ripped through the final shreds of the Graves defense. Harper played a new recording, a phone call the prosecution had managed to intercept during the independent inquiry. Dexter's voice was unmistakable, tense and hurried, speaking to the doctor. "Make sure the testimony matches what we need," Dexter said plainly. The murmur in the courtroom exploded instantly. The judge slammed his gavel down twice to restore order, but the shock was already tearing through the room. Dexter stood, stammering denials, while Marilyn's face drained completely of color. She tried to distance herself from him, shaking her head, but her eyes betrayed everything. She knew. She had always known the entire scheme. Harper pressed forward, holding the ultimate piece of evidence. She submitted a sealed letter addressed directly to Judge Rowan Hale, written by Alistair, just 2 months before his death. The judge opened it with a deliberate steadiness that made the entire room hold its breath. Alistair's handwriting flowed across the page, clear and steady, affirming his decision to revise the will, and explicitly stating that his mental faculties were intact. He had anticipated this. He had known Marilyn would return for the money. Then came the words that silenced every breath, every rustle, every murmur in the courtroom. "If my daughter returns, it will be for what I have, not for who I am. Protect the truth for Randy, the only one who stayed." The sheer weight of those words, the wisdom, the love, and the final judgment from the only man who had the right to make it, demolished every remaining argument Marilyn had built. Before the judge could speak further, an elderly man in the gallery, a stranger to me, stood up, his hand trembling. He confessed, his voice barely audible, that he had been approached and paid by Marilyn weeks ago to give false testimony about Alistair being isolated. He apologized directly to the court, then turned and apologized to me. It was as if the final threads holding 3 decades of their lives together had snapped all at once. A flood of relief, mixed with deep, consuming grief, washed through me as the truth finally broke open. For 30 years, my existence had been defined by their absence. Now, their entire manufactured story was collapsing under the weight of my grandparents' unwavering evidence. As I listened to the echoes of Alistair's words, I felt something profound shift inside me. This wasn't merely a legal victory. This was the protection of the two people who had chosen me when no one else would. This was the final defense of their integrity and the life they built for me. The verdict wasn't even necessary for the truth to be known. The morning of the final judgment was wrapped in a layer of gray clouds, a somber mood that matched the gravity of the courthouse. The moral verdict had been delivered in the emotional climax of the previous day, but the legal reality still had to be faced. Judge Rowan Hale began by presenting the results of the independent investigation he had ordered. The courtroom was utterly motionless as he read the findings. The doctor was indeed not a treating physician and had never examined Alistair. His testimony had been bought. The audio recording submitted by the Graveses had been digitally altered to sound like my grandfather. The timeline of their abandonment claims was inconsistent with documented travel records. The truth was no longer a matter of interpretation. It was established fact. Then came the final, devastating blow. Investigators traced payments made to the fake doctor and the paid witness directly to Dexter. The evidence used to coach the witness, the specific, fraudulent details, came from Marilyn. Their scheme was not just deceitful, it was deliberate, coordinated, and criminal conspiracy. Harper stepped forward, asking the court to consider charges for fraud, obstruction of justice, and filing a false police report, formally submitting the request into the official record. For the first time since the trial began, Marilyn's composure completely shattered. She slumped back into her chair, hands trembling uncontrollably. Her perfect facade was utterly destroyed. Dexter kept his head down, unable to look at me, unable to look at anyone. As Judge Hale formally read Alistair's sealed letter aloud one last time, affirming his decision and his trust in me, I closed my eyes. Hearing his steady, wise, resolute voice break through the courtroom felt like he had returned to carry the truth himself. The judge delivered the final ruling. The will was valid. The case was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could never be filed again. All legal fees would be paid by Marilyn and Dexter, and the matter of their criminal misconduct would be forwarded to the district attorney's office for review. It was over. As people began to filter out, Marilyn suddenly rushed toward me, her mascara streaked down her cheeks, her voice frayed and high-pitched. She grasped my arm, her touch instantly repulsive after everything I had learned. "We can fix this," she pleaded, her desperation replacing her narcissism for the first time. "We can start over, Jacob. You owe me that. I gave you life." Her words felt like a shard of ice sliding into my chest, the ultimate self-serving act of entitlement. I looked at the woman who had walked away from her child, now watching her entire life and scheme unravel. For the first time, I felt no hatred, only profound pity and cold certainty that she had sealed her own fate. I answered her calmly, removing her hand from my arm. "The people who raise you are your parents. Biology is not love." Then, I walked away. I did not look back, leaving her standing there amidst the wreckage of her own choices. I had won the case, and more importantly, I had finally severed the last, painful emotional tether to the people who never chose me. With the verdict delivered, and the toxic emotional exchange with Marilyn complete, the city felt cold, heavy, and loud. Returning to Aspen felt like stepping into a memory that was finally safe. I spent days cleaning my grandparents' cabin, slowly touching each object, as if greeting a loyal friend. In a Leicester's study, tucked beneath a layer of old legal briefs, I found a small, wooden box labeled, "For when you win." Inside was a miniature gavel, meticulously hand-carved, a perfect replica of the one he used for decades. Etched beneath it was a single sentence: "Justice is not an act but a legacy." A year later, that gavel rested on a shelf in my new chambers. I had spent the time working tirelessly, driven by the principles Leicester instilled in me, and I was appointed the youngest judge in Colorado. My life had taken a new shape, one built not on the wounds my parents left behind, but on the unwavering values my grandparents gave me. On the first warm day of spring, I returned to the cemetery overlooking the valley. I laid a bouquet of lupine, the tall purple spires that grew behind the cabin, on the graves of Leicester and Odette. I whispered into the quiet mountain air, "I didn't just win the case. I won back the part of myself that always belonged to you." As I walked down the hillside, sunlight cutting through the last traces of winter snow, I understood something I should have known long ago. Family is not determined by the people who create us, but by the people who choose us, stay for us, and love us without condition. I had carried my abandonment like a shadow stitched to my heels, believing it defined me, shaped me, and limited me. But the trial, and the truth it exposed, proved the opposite. My grandparents have been rewriting that story for me from the moment they opened their front door and found me in the snow. Winning the case didn't magically erase the hurt, but it confirmed the strength of the quiet, unwavering love that built me. Leicester's final words resonated now, clear and true. Truth survives everything. The truth of who raised me, and the truth that I had never been alone. Survival was not the victory, becoming whole, finally free from the need to be chosen by my biological parents, was.